He was a man who saw himself as the savior of Italy, yet in the end, his corpse was hung in the town square where people kicked it in hatred. How did a simple schoolteacher become the dictator who led his country to ruin? From his early days as a believer in socialism to the moment he seized power with the cries of, "I am always right." And finally, his downfall, when even his closest allies betrayed him. This is the story of Mussolini, the man who sought to change history but became a lesson in it instead. On July 29, 1883, in a small town called Dovia di Predapio in Italy, Benito Mussolini was born. His family played a crucial role in shaping his personality. His father, Alessandro Mussolini, was a blacksmith and a staunch supporter of socialism who was deeply interested in politics and constantly spoke of revolution and equality. On the other hand, his mother, Rosa Maltoni, was a schoolteacher and a devoutly religious woman who tried to maintain balance in their family life. This contrast between his parents' beliefs influenced Mussolini's way of thinking from a young age. Mussolini displayed aggressive behavior as a child and was expelled from school multiple times for fighting with other children. Rebellion and defiance were part of his nature, and it quickly became clear that he was not an ordinary child. However, he was intelligent and had a strong passion for reading, especially about politics. As a teenager, under his father's influence, he developed an interest in socialist and anti-capitalist ideas. Although his mother hoped he would choose a more peaceful path, Mussolini was always drawn to revolutionary ideologies. He continued his education at a religious boarding school, but even there, his unruly behavior caused significant problems. In the following years, to escape problems and find work, he migrated to Switzerland for a while. This short but significant journey deepened his political views. During this time, he became acquainted with socialist and anarchist activists and gradually realized that he wanted to play a more prominent role in politics. This was only the beginning. Mussolini was still at the start of a path that would ultimately lead him to absolute power in Italy. After spending some time in Switzerland, Mussolini returned to Italy in 1904. During this period, he was arrested multiple times by the police for his socialist activities and participation in labor protests. However, his skill in public speaking and writing quickly earned him a position within the Italian Socialist Party. Mussolini began his career as a journalist, writing sharp and aggressive articles against capitalism, the church, and the government. He was an extreme anti-religious figure, believing that the church was one of the main obstacles to societal progress. In 1912, due to his writing talent, he became the editor-in-chief of the party's newspaper, Avanti. During this time, his articles and speeches had a significant impact on the socialist movement in Italy, gradually making him one of the party's key figures. However, Italy's entry into World War I in 1914 changed everything. The Socialist Party opposed the war, believing it only served capitalism and imperialism. But Mussolini developed a different perspective. He saw the war as an opportunity to expand Italy's power and believed the country should participate. This shift in opinion led to a severe conflict with party leaders, and ultimately, he was expelled from the Socialist Party for supporting the war. This event was a turning point in Mussolini's life. Now that he had been cast out of the socialist movement, he embarked on a new path, one that would ultimately lead to the birth of fascism. After being expelled from the Socialist Party, Mussolini decided to forge his own path. His support for Italy's entry into World War I transformed him from a revolutionary socialist into a radical nationalist. This shift in ideology earned him many enemies, but also attracted new followers. To promote his new ideas, he launched a newspaper called Il Popolo di Italia in 1914. Unlike Avanti, which was socialist, this newspaper promoted nationalism and militarism. Instead of advocating for a workers' revolution, Mussolini now championed the expansion of Italian power and national unity. In 1915, when Italy officially entered the war, Mussolini volunteered and went to the front. However, his military career was short-lived. In 1917, he was seriously injured by a mortar explosion and had to leave the army. This experience on the battlefield profoundly changed his thinking. He was no longer just a nationalist. Ideas of absolute power and charismatic leadership were beginning to take root in his mind. After returning from the war, Mussolini started attracting former soldiers, nationalists, and anti-socialists. World War I had left Italy in economic crisis and widespread discontent. Mussolini took advantage of this frustration and took his first steps toward building a new movement. In 1919, he founded Fascist di Combattimento, a group that would later evolve into the Fascist Party and reshape Italy's future. After World War I, Italy was plunged into economic crisis, unemployment, and widespread protests. People were dissatisfied with the government, and communist and socialist groups were gaining strength. Mussolini took advantage of this chaos and in 1919 founded the Fascist di Combattimento, which became the core of the future Fascist Party. This group included former soldiers, extreme nationalists, and opponents of socialism. Mussolini introduced fiery slogans like "Italy must be great again" and claimed that the only way to save the country was through a strong nationalist government. However, in the 1919 elections, the fascists suffered a crushing defeat, failing to win a single seat in parliament. This failure forced Mussolini to change his tactics. In 1921, the National Fascist Party was officially established. Mussolini relied on paramilitary groups known as the Black Shirts, who used violence and intimidation to suppress political rivals like socialists and communists. Their attacks on striking workers and leftist gatherings made the fascists appear as defenders of order and security among the middle class and industrialists. In 1922, Italy's political crisis reached its peak. Mussolini saw the opportunity and, on October 27th, organized the March on Rome. Thousands of black shirts marched toward the capital, creating tension throughout the country. The government at the time was weak, and King Victor Emmanuel III, fearing internal conflict, appointed Mussolini as prime minister instead of confronting the fascists. Mussolini took control of Italy without a bloody revolution, but through threats and a show of power. However, this was just the beginning of his journey. When Mussolini became prime minister in 1922, he had not yet achieved absolute power. Italy still had a king, a parliament, and a constitution, but Mussolini did not want to be just an ordinary politician. His goal was total dictatorship. In the early years, Mussolini gradually eliminated opposition parties, free press, and democratic institutions. The Black Shirts played a crucial role in suppressing opponents. In 1924, Giacomo Matteotti, a socialist politician who strongly opposed fascism, was mysteriously murdered. Everyone knew the murder was carried out on Mussolini's orders, but he used this crisis to his advantage. In 1925, Mussolini officially declared that he would no longer adhere to any democratic institutions and solidified the fascist government. All parties except the Fascist Party were banned, the press was censored, and the OVRA's secret police was established to suppress opposition. Mussolini was not just the prime minister, but the undisputed leader of Italy. Mussolini knew well that to maintain power, he had to create a legendary image of himself. The media constantly portrayed him as a heroic, strong, and flawless leader. Photos of him exercising, giving speeches, and visiting industrial projects were everywhere. He presented himself as the man who is always right, and anyone who opposed him was either censored or disappeared. Mussolini attempted to modernize Italy's economy. Industrialization programs, road construction, land reclamation, and increased domestic production were implemented. However, despite the extensive propaganda, Italy's economic situation never truly became strong. Poverty persisted and dissatisfaction gradually grew. Education was also entirely under the government's control. Textbooks were changed, and schools were required to present Mussolini as a great leader. Children were enlisted in fascist organizations from an early age to ensure their loyalty to the regime. By 1939, Mussolini was at the height of his power. However, the decisions he made in the following decade would change both his fate and that of his country. He believed Italy was ready to become an empire, but in reality, he was stepping toward its destruction. By the late 1930s, Mussolini had portrayed himself as a strong leader, but the reality was that Italy's economy was weak and its military was ill-prepared for war. Nevertheless, Mussolini's ambitions led him to align with Hitler, entering a conflict that would change his fate. From the beginning of Hitler's rise, Mussolini was intrigued by Nazi ideology but didn't want to be overshadowed by Germany. In 1936, he formed a friendship pact with Hitler, which later evolved into the Rome-Berlin Axis. Then in 1939, Italy and Germany signed the Pact of Steel, marking a military alliance between the two nations. However, Mussolini was still uncertain about Italy's readiness for war, which is why, when World War II broke out in 1939, Italy initially stayed out of the conflict. In 1940, when Germany swiftly defeated France, Mussolini believed the war would end quickly, and if he didn't join the battle, he would miss out on the spoils of war. So, on June 10, 1940, Italy officially entered the war, declaring war on France and Britain. The problem, however, was that Italy's military was not prepared for a large-scale conflict. Mussolini, without consulting Hitler, ordered an invasion of Greece, but the Greek army was stronger than expected and pushed the Italians back. Eventually, Germany had to intervene and occupy Greece, which exposed Italy's military weakness. Mussolini aimed to conquer North Africa, but British forces in Libya and Egypt defeated the Italian army. Once again, Germany had to step in, sending General Rommel to assist the Italians. When Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union, Mussolini also sent troops to the Eastern Front. However, these forces were destroyed in the brutal cold and against the Red Army. All these defeats led to growing disillusionment among the Italian people. The country's economy worsened, food became scarce, and the Allies' bombings destroyed Italian cities. Even Mussolini's close associates started to realize that they needed to get rid of him. By 1943, Mussolini was completely in a position of weakness. The final blow came when the Allies invaded Italy, and the King of Italy decided to remove Mussolini from power. By 1943, Mussolini had lost nearly all his credibility and power. Military defeats, poverty, and the Allies' bombings had exhausted the Italian people, and even his closest associates were contemplating his downfall. However, Mussolini still believed he could regain control. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces attacked Sicily. This attack made it clear that Italy's collapse was imminent. Shortly after, on July 25, 1943, Mussolini attended a meeting with King Victor Emmanuel III, but this time, things were different. The king told Mussolini that he no longer trusted him and issued an order for his arrest. That night, Mussolini was detained by royal forces and removed from power. After his arrest, Mussolini was moved to a secret location in the mountains of Italy to prevent him from escaping or regaining power. The fascist regime collapsed, and Italy began negotiating with the Allies to exit the war. Hitler didn't want one of his former allies to meet such an end. In September 1943, a special German unit led by Otto Skorzeny rescued Mussolini from the mountain prison. After his rescue, Hitler offered him the chance to establish a new government in northern Italy under Germany's support. Mussolini founded the Italian Social Republic in the town of Salo, but in reality, this government was merely a puppet state entirely controlled by Nazi Germany. We've already covered Hitler's biography, and I'll leave the link in the caption for you to check out. Once a self-proclaimed invincible leader, Mussolini was now just a worthless pawn in the war. He had lost the support of the people, his army was weakened, and even the Germans no longer trusted him. In early 1945, the Allies were rapidly advancing through northern Italy, and fascist forces were surrendering one after another. Mussolini knew his time was up, so he decided to flee Italy on April 25, 1945. However, while trying to escape to Switzerland, he was identified and captured by Italian partisans. This time, there was no force to save him. 2 days later, it was decided that he would be erased from the stage of history forever. After his capture, Mussolini, along with his lover Clara Petacci, was executed by Italian partisans in the small village of Giuliano di Mezzegra on April 28, 1945. Without trial, they were lined up against a wall and shot. But the humiliating end didn't stop there. The bodies of Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and several other fascist officials were taken to Milan and hung by their feet in the Piazzale Loreto. This was the same square where the fascists had executed resistance members just a few years earlier. Now, an angry mob gathered and kicked, spat on, and even shot at the lifeless bodies. For a man who once saw himself as the leader of Italy, this was a degrading fate. Mussolini, who had once ascended to power through a show of strength, was now cruelly erased from the pages of history. Mussolini's death marked the official end of fascism in Italy, but his ideas still had an impact. After the war, Italy became a democratic republic, and fascism was officially banned. However, neo-Nazi and far-right groups across Europe still draw inspiration from Mussolini, and some of his supporters continue to attempt to portray him in a more positive light. Ultimately, Mussolini is remembered as one of history's most controversial figures, a man who rose to power with fiery rhetoric and violent policies, but who, through his warmongering, military failures, and poor decisions, led both himself and his country to ruin. Please comment your opinion, and don't forget to like the video. Every video is a journey into the rifts of history.